here with the 5th program in Series 3 of the Sewing Connection. Making a one-layer coat is a quick, easy project and suitable for all skill levels. A great transitional coat when you need something, but it's not cold enough for a heavy winter coat with all its many layers. Also, it's unbeatable for travel. It might even take the shape of a fitted little Austrian boiled wool jacket. Or perhaps it goes casual in a short fun coat to wear with pants. One layer means that you can see both sides, so the fabric must be attractive either way. In fact, you can plan a reversible if you like. The pattern should be something very simple and with a loose fit unless the fabric is very stable and sturdy to hold its shape. Every pattern brand will have several appropriate choices. It may have buttons and pockets or not. It may be worn loose or belted. You're the designer and you make the choices. The first one I have here on the rack is one of these one-layer coats that could be reversible possibly because both sides of the fabric are very nice. Both sides of them, in fact, are showing. Notice how with this one it has this big shawl collar. Well, that's a continuation of the front, and because here's what I have chosen for the right side of the fabric, we're seeing the wrong side as I have the collar folded down. Now this is a mohair and you must make a choice when you cut this out or when you're putting the pattern on it. You must decide how you have the nap going. Some people purposely have it going up so that it gets all fuzzy and pilly and those little balls on it. As far as I'm concerned, it must go down because I don't want those things. And if it goes down, I find it wears better and it stays new looking longer. So always I have the nap going down, but that's your choice. Also on this, you're going to have to decide on such things as buttons and buttonholes, if it has any, what kind of seam finishes you're going to have, what kind of hems, pockets, if there will be any. So you have a lot of choices to make on this. Now this was a pattern that came from a pattern book for a coat, but it was not a one-layer coat. It had inside it the interfacings, the linings, the usual things that come in a coat. So I have just taken the outer shell of that pattern, that coat, and made this out of it. Another coat I have here I actually had, about 2 series ago, and this one was really made from a t-shirt pattern. It wasn't even made from a coat pattern, but this is also that mohair where it's smooth going down, and the back side of it looks very similar, but it doesn't have as much texture. So this is also a one-layer coat, a very simple coat. You just fold up the cuffs as far as you want them. Everything about it is very easy, very quick. It's a matter of making it in a small part of a day. Another one here is a polar fleece coat, and this isn't actually a woven fabric. This one is a knit fabric. It's something that you might use any place that you'd make sweatshirts. It's that type of fabric that just makes up so easily. Both sides of it look almost the same. It's a little bit more textury on the inside, but this is another good choice for it because it's easy to work with. You don't have to have much finishing worries involved, and it's something that you might want to try. Another one I have back here I didn't make. This is actually a purchased coat, but it's a good idea and it's one you might want to consider. It's a one-layer coat here on the inside, and this can be worn by itself. It has its own pocket and button and all the right equipment. It's a one-layer coat, just one layer of fabric here, but it's used as a liner inside a raincoat. The only thing that holds it in place is the way the collar folds over and the way the cuffs are turned up. So this is another choice. You might just take a pattern off an existing coat that you have and make it into a one-layer coat that would be usable. Well, the one I'm mainly going to work with today is this one, so I'll just bring it out in front. And then I'm going to a little later show you some of those Austrian boiled wool jackets also. But with this one, as I said, we're going to have to be concerned about what we're going to do with the seams and with the buttonholes, if there are any, with the hems, the pockets, and other than that, it's going to be just a real easy thing. So mainly it'll be trying to see what kind of machine choices we have, what kind of stitching choices we have, and I'm going to start out here on the serger. And I'm going to make a quick serge seam. This is a 4-thread serger here, so I'll make this seam. And as I do this, I am going to trim off a little bit of it. It's thick fabric. It doesn't want to start through. There it goes. Okay, with this one, after I make this one quick sample, and what I also wanted to see as I made that sample was, can I do it that casually? Can I just sort of hold it and watch it go there, or will the top layer scoot along, in which case you better put a few pins away from the serger. You don't want to get them in the way, but you better put a few pins. This one didn't seem to scoot at all, therefore I can be pretty casual in making this coat. I think it's all that texture. It held together pretty well. If I did do this serger seam, then I still have a choice. It might be just pressing it to one side and leaving it at that, or it might be, after it's pressed, that I want to do a top stitching on it so that it looks sort of like a mock flat-felled seam. So, a couple of choices there. And with this one, I think I'll probably just leave it as is because it seemed to work out well. Watch also, as you're making a little sample before you do your coat, watch also to see, can I put my iron directly down on it? Now, I do have steam in this iron, but I want to know if I can put it directly down on it or if it destroys the texture, the surface, the look of it, in which case use a press cloth so that you won't have anything nasty happening to it so that it will stay very nice looking. So this is one choice, a very easy choice. Do the whole thing with the serger and you can have it done in seconds. Then for the people who don't have, I'll just put this little sample over here by the serger. For the people who don't have a serger, let's see what some of the machine choices are, because there are a whole lot of them there and they are varied. So let's do some machine choices. Because this is a Ravelly fabric, I'm not going to just do a plain old seam and press it open. I'd have a problem. It all ravels. So I have to do something to finish those edges always. That something might be a flat-felled seam, in which case I would probably put right sides together. So here on this scrap I have the two right sides together, and I'm going to make just a regular 5/8 inch seam. And then after that seam is made, I'm going to, this is scooting just a little bit, so I'm going to loosen the pressure on that presser foot just slightly so that it won't move along. And after this is made, then it's a matter of pressing this out, and with any seam you usually press it flat first to kind of meld those threads in so that it stays, so that it starts out right, and then I'm going to press it open. And after it's pressed open, I'm going to trim off one of those seams so that it's quite short, and that seam that's very short is going to be in between the outer layer of the coat and the other seam. So I'll trim this one off so that it's just, maybe somewhere a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch is what I have remaining here. And then I want to fold the big seam over it. And in addition to doing this, I also want to make a little hem in that seam. So I'm actually going to turn it under a second time. And this is a flat-felled seam. It goes to one side. And then from the outside of the coat, you'll be able to see a double-stitched line. Well, not really. You'll just see one stitching line from the outside, but the seam will be there also, making the second line. It's from the inside of the coat, actually, that you can really see the two stitching lines. You're going to be able to see these two stitching lines, though, in two different colors because I used a red or a pink on the bobbin thread, and I used a cream on the upper thread. Therefore, it'll be two different lines of stitching here. So, with this flat-felled seam then, we just go ahead and get that started, and we are going to have a second line. This is a very sturdy seam. It stays very flat. It's really very easy to do. Because this fabric is heavier, I also could have bigger stitches than what I had. So I might decide to do that after I do my sample. I might decide that on my coat I really want to have bigger stitches. And so this is something you try out on these scraps. I wouldn't ever work directly on the coat. I always like to instead work on some scraps, just a little bit. You're always going to have scraps, so that you know exactly what you're doing, and then you're pleased with the results. You won't make any mistakes and won't have any ripping out to do on that coat. Another seam we might make is one that this ravels, as I said, so easily. This is just an experiment. I don't know what would happen, but think about making a seam and then pressing it open. I'm making this seam now, and it's going to be on the outside of the coat instead of the inside. But because it ravels so easily, at least it does when you first start it, once you get going, it probably would get caught on all those fibers and not ravel that easily. But what I'm going to do is press this open, and then maybe think about just, no, I'm not going to press it open on second thought. I'm going to press it closed, because I think I want to make another line of stitching just to stabilize this. My first thought was ravel it out, fray it out, all the way to the stitching line. But if so, it would be very weak, and it could fall apart very easily if it didn't have anything to hold it. It would probably be more sensible to press it to one side, do another line of stitching right next to it, very close to it, in fact, just using one of those little places that are in the presser foot, the little curves, the little stair steps that go here and there. So this is, less than a quarter inch away. It's really quite close. And after I do this, then I'd ravel out everything that's here. And that would take a good little bit of time, perhaps. But it might make a very interesting seam to just have these seams raveled. This is a good fringy year. There are a lot of fringes showing every place. And so this might be a good thing to do with those. It would be kind of pretty to have just all those fuzzy seams, everything raveled out everywhere. Kind of casual look. It might be pretty, though. So something else you might try there. Here's a thought with seams. I'm going to put the right side together again and just stitch a plain seam. And after I have that stitched, let's think of what we can cover it with. Now this one I'm stitching, I'm using the other side of the coat in this case for my right side. And after I have this stitched, I'm going to press it open. And then with that pressed open, I'm going to have to do a little trimming, and then I'm going to cover those seams. So I'll give it a little press here first. And then what I'm going to cover those seams with is scraps of ultra suede. If you're going to do a whole lot of seam covering, which I did over here on this coat that's hanging here, since I did so many covered seams, it was necessary to buy, instead of just using scraps, I actually bought some ultra suede for it. Okay, now I'd trim these seams down short, probably to, less than a quarter inch, so that they're really quite short. And then when they're trimmed down, I'm going to cover it. And this might be a contrast, or it might be the very same color. I couldn't get the very same color in this, and I decided that anyway, it's kind of fun to have a little bit of a contrast, so I did on that coat use a contrast, or at least a little lighter tint of this same burgundy color. But what I did was use a little ultra suede like this, and I tried it two ways. I tried it just with a straight strip, and I tried it with some in pinking shears to see if I liked it that way. And I kind of decided, well, I like that little bit of extra decor there by having this done with pinking shears. So either way, straight or with the pinking shears. You might even try it not only with one layer of fabric, you might put a second one there. So perhaps instead of just this one layer, maybe I want to do another. Let's see what other color I can come up with. Here's one that's closely related. This one is just a little bit different, a little bit duller, but it's basically the same color. So this one might be fun to put under it as a base. I'll just go ahead and put it down here. Now when you sew on ultra suede, do have a fine needle. I would not use a leather needle. I would use just a fine needle, about a number 70, 75, 80, nothing bigger than that. But I'm going to be stitching through a couple layers of ultra suede here, as well as the coat. And I'd put this on top, and you might decide it's easier to do this in two operations instead of one. Just to do a little quick job here, I'm going to do it over one only. So I'll pin this in place a couple of places because I want it to hold securely here. And then when I do this stitching, I am not only going to use a small needle, but also think about what foot you use. And there are a couple of good choices here. A Teflon foot might work well. So if you have a Teflon foot, try that out. Actually, one of my favorite feet when I sew on the synthetic suedes is to use a straight stitch foot. And the difference in a straight stitch foot, and I'll show you here, I'll put out a Teflon foot which looks like this. Maybe push my ironing board back just a speck. Here's a Teflon foot, and it slides nicely over the ultra suede or over the ultra leather or whatever it is you're using. And then here's a straight stitch foot. And what the difference is this straight stitch foot, as opposed to the multi-purpose foot, has a small hole right here in the center. There's just one little hole. And that one little tiny hole, what that means is that the needle just goes down in that one position and there's no play in the fabric. There is play in this wider hole that we have here, and because of that you might skip some stitches. So that's why my personal preference is this straight stitch foot. If you don't have one, because they don't always come with the machine, sometimes just the multi-purpose foot and a few others, but they don't always come with the machine. You can get them, however. Go to the dealer and see if you have some other options there. So when I do this, I'm going to kind of pull the suede because I like to keep it taut. Besides using a straight stitch foot and besides using a fine needle, I like to keep that suede held in a tense position so that it doesn't bubble up or change positions in any way. Okay, I would do this on both sides. Actually, even though I used a white thread, it kind of fades into the fabric and it doesn't really show that much. You would, of course, use the very same color thread. But anyway, this is a thought. And after I get it finished, I might decide, well, it wasn't the best thought. Let's see what some other options are. So you just go on and on playing with these scraps until you have what you really like best. This, I think, if I would actually use something like this, I would probably like it best trimmed off a little shorter, so I might just take off a little bit more than that. Instead of having this out as wide as it is, maybe I'd cut it down to, oh, just 1/8 of an inch showing here. So scraps are the perfect place to play around and find out what's going to work best, what's going to look best, and then use that one as your final, as you go ahead and make your coat. Because this ravels, another thought might be to just ravel out some of these yarns and twist them slightly and do a little couching over them. As you get farther into the fabric, it's harder to get the yarns out. They start raveling very easily right on the edge, and then they're a little difficult. But these yarns are very pretty. And what couching would be is just putting them over a seam after you have stitched it and twisting them like this, and then doing a little decorative stitch, a little couching, a little either a zigzag or some sort of a stitch that would catch those yarns in place but keep them there to do a decorative look on the seams. Now remember, you don't have many seams in this coat. It's going to be a simple coat. Therefore, you don't have to worry about hundreds of yards of this stuff. It's just a little bit of it you'd be doing in most cases, so it isn't going to be terribly complicated. Then after you've exhausted all the seam possibilities that you can think of, and I'm sure you can think of a lot more than what I've done already, think buttonholes. While I have this yarn raveled out, one easy buttonhole would be to do it on the other side of your machine, not where you usually work, but down here on the side of the machine with an empty bobbin. And because these yarns that I just raveled aren't really long enough to do what I want to do with them, I'm going to twist them, but because they aren't really long enough, I'm going to just take a piece of yarn here instead to make it a little easier. And with this piece of yarn, I'm going to put it through the bobbin, just so that a little bit of the yarn comes through the bobbin and clamps on. I'm then going to put it on my bobbin winder here at the side of the machine, and I'm going to push the power and let it wind. And as this winds more and more, it will finally come to the point where it starts pulling my hand in. Here it is, it's pulling my hand in right now because it's so tightly wound that it's getting short. So when it gets to that point, take a finger right in the middle of it here and pull that finger out so that you're doubling the yarn down here. And then I'm going to hold this together and I'm going to let go with my hand up here on top. I'm going to let go and it'll wind this very nicely into this heavier cord. So now I have a several plied yarn, a very heavy one, a very sturdy one, and this in fact is what I did on the coat that's hanging in the front of the rack. I used this very same technique, winding the yarns that were really raveled out from the fabric. I used this technique and twisted it, and it's now very, very sturdy. So it makes a good little button loop there if you want to have that. A buttonhole that you might make would be, if you're going to actually do buttonholes with the buttonhole foot, do machine buttonholes, I'll put on that foot, then you better reinforce it in some way because we only have one layer of wool or one layer of whatever the fabric is, and it's not all that sturdy, so we better reinforce it. So I'm going to press this with some interfacing on. This is just a little scrap of fabric that I'm going to cut down to size and use on the back side of the coat. So I will go ahead and fuse this, and beyond fusing this, I'm going to do something else, which is fusing a little piece of interface or of fusible web to the back side. This is the type with a release sheet on it. So I'll just fuse this down and then release it by pulling the paper off, and then cut this buttonhole down to size. So here I'm peeling the paper off. Now what I have would fuse directly on my coat. The decision must be made. What to do around the edges. Is it going to ravel? Probably not, because I have all this fusing to the edge of the fabric by the time I cut it down to size. So if I would, for instance, just cut this down into an oval, I could then fuse it to the back side of my coat, and I could go ahead and do a buttonhole in it. Now this is actually what I did in that gray coat that I showed you, the one that I had made from a t-shirt. I simply fused this to the back side of it. If you think that your fabric would ravel eventually, then it would be a good idea to, now I'll press this to the back side of my fabric. If you think it would ravel, then it would be a good idea to go around this with the serger so that you have it all covered, or to go around it with zigzag on your machine. But anyway, cover it in some way if you think there's any possibility of it raveling, because we don't want it to do that. And then I'm just going to fuse this in place, and then we can make a machine buttonhole on it. If you would do it just in the one layer of fabric, make the buttonhole, it would not be too good an idea, because it would probably be weak and pull out, and it would sort of flare open. It just is not a good idea. I'm going to have to put a couple of pins here so that I know where it is, because I can't see it from the right side, so I'll put pins so that they're right in the center of it. They're going right down the center, but they're just in the right size. I'm going to use this button on it, so I decide from this how long I want that button hole, and then I go ahead and make a buttonhole out of it. So this is one choice, to make that buttonhole right here between the two pins. So I'll just set this on buttonhole, and I'll go ahead and pull a pin out and make that buttonhole. Now of course you would do this not in the white thread I'm doing, but in the matching thread. Whatever goes with the fabric that you're using is the way you want to do it. And I think we have it long enough, so we'll come across and come back. And then after we have that buttonhole made, fine, we're home free. It also is a very good idea to reinforce wherever your button's going to be, because you realize it would pull out. It would not hold securely if you just had that button stitched to the one layer of coat. So you do the same thing on the other side. Wherever it is that the button's going to be stitched on, you'd have to put that same type of reinforcement there. Instead of doing this, it wouldn't be a bad idea to use a little ultra suede here for a buttonhole. And if you're going to do that, I have some already with the fusible on the back side, that fusible web with the release sheet. I would cut a couple of pieces here, and I want these pieces not to be quite the same size. I want one to be just a little bit smaller on the top side and a little bit larger one on the back side. So I'm going to cut this one slightly smaller, And I'll cut it a little bit smaller here still over on this side. And now I would need to, on a layer of fabric, put the smaller one on the front side and put the larger one on the back side directly under it, and then fuse those. Now if I'm going to do these, I would have to, of course, get them placed just exactly right, fused so that they are in the same place. Check them out with pins by holding them up to the light, whatever it takes to do a perfect job here. Then don't put your iron directly down on this ultra suede. Put a press cloth on top when you fuse it. And after this is fused, you're ready to stitch a buttonhole. I'm afraid that we're not going to be able to finish that coat this time. So we have our coat now all together. I'm just fusing this buttonhole, and it took very little time to think through these things. Probably it wouldn't take too much more time to make the coat. Well, a major choice is still to come. Since we've run out of time, we'll have to come back next week and decide what else to do out on the edge.